Please be seated. Good evening to all of you. I know, we know, you are out there and marking this sacred moment with us. As we enter into Yom Kippur, I wish each and every one of you a safe year, a year of good health, a year of comfort, a year of hope and of healing. We are all tested by our circumstances this year. And like our ancestors who were tested in their generations and sometimes in ways more acute and dangerous than ours, we shall endure. We shall pass this test together as a Kehilat Kodesh, as a holy congregation. Throughout the past months, I have found myself reflecting, returning to, repeating an old Hasidic song and adage. Kol ha'olam kulo, the whole world, the world in its entirety, is a gesher tsar me'od, a very narrow bridge, a gesher tsar me'od. V'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. And the principle that must guide us is that we must not be afraid. We must not fear at all. We must overcome our fears. As I have been daily repeating this to myself, I have found my mind increasingly turning to the inspiration of those who have preceded us and who have allowed us to arrive in this moment in time. I have found myself thinking back, generations back. I have found myself thinking back to my early life, to the events of 50 years ago, the high holy days of 1970. In my mind, 1970 is always associated with the gifts of the lives of extraordinary musicians and performers, and the untimely deaths of musicians like Jimi Hendrix and the amazing Janis Joplin. Of course, a number of other things happened in 1970. Remember, there was a large, unprecedented postal strike in 1970. In March 1970, a pay dispute erupted between postal workers and the federal government. You see, Congress approved a 4% pay raise for postal workers, while members of the House of Representatives offered themselves a 41% increase in their pay. That did not go down all that well. The Postal Service had been suffering from a lag in investment, working conditions had been deteriorating in its facilities, and postal workers claimed that their salaries no longer allowed them to live in the cities and communities they served. In the light of the government's refusal to address these issues, negotiations were also complicated by suspicion that other factors were at play. The United States Postal Service workforce had changed throughout a number of years, almost a decade. As salaries declined and working conditions worsened, white postal workers were leaving, while the workforce became increasingly black. The strike that started in New York City would spread to other communities as talks stalled. Later in March, President Nixon declared a national emergency and ordered 24,000 military personnel to distribute mail and to replace the postal workers, a move that was widely regarded as an attack on the United States Postal Service. The strike only resolved following the failure of military personnel to handle the mail. Recognition of the right of collective bargaining for postal workers and a more significant set of increases to their pay. Yet, the perception of an attack by the federal government on the United States Postal Service remained. 1970 was also a year of continued and painful racial unrest. Now, a number of years following passage of the Civil Rights Act and other legislation, the black community was frustrated with what was perceived as slow progress in dismantling systemic racism on the ground, especially in the great cities of this country. Yet another aspect of the problem was considered to be police brutality, police violence. For example, in December of 1969, then 21 years old, Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, the vice president, the national vice president of the Black Panthers Party, and the founder of the Rainbow Coalition, an interracial, interethnic coalition that he initially formed to increase support to the black cause, a person who had also tried to work between black gangs as an intermediary in Chicago with a view to reducing intra-community violence, was killed in a police raid, along with Mark Clark. In early 1970, a coroner's inquest into the event found that it was justifiable homicide. The coroner's decision was not universally well received. There were a number of other such instances that year. In July of 1970, Rick Tiger Dowdell, an unarmed 19-year-old, a student at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, was killed by a police officer who shot him in the back of the head. Of course, there was also the high-profile death of one of the leading journalists and activists of the Hispanic community on the West Coast, Ruben Salazar, a Los Angeles Times reporter, while participating in a rally against the Vietnam War in August of 1970. He was directly hit by a tear gas canister fired by the police and immediately lost his life. At the same time, there was a great deal of violence directed at the police. After the bombing of Hunters Point police stations outside San Francisco, which caused damage to the facility, on February 16th, San Francisco Police's Park Station was attacked. A pipe bomb filled with shrapnel was placed on the windowsill of the station. Sergeant Brian McDonnell was severely injured and died of his injuries in hospital. Officer Robert Fogarty was also severely injured and blinded in this incident. 8 other officers were injured. Initial reports suggested this was the work of the Weather Underground, perhaps the Black Liberation Army. When then Governor Ronald Reagan reacted to these attacks, and speaking for so many Californians and others throughout this country, he called these attacks the most cowardly, despicable things anyone can imagine. The world is a narrow bridge. The whole world, a very narrow bridge. Of course, in the midst of all of this, the 91st Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. This piece of legislation was swiftly followed by the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was Title II of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Following these legislative successes in 1971, President Nixon would declare the United States war on drugs, stating that drugs were America's, and I quote, public enemy number one. You may recall that in a controversial and disputed 1994 Harper's Magazine interview, John Ehrlichman, who had been President Nixon's domestic policy chief, and by the way, Ehrlichman had been a graduate of UCLA and of the Stanford Law School, and had served as an airman with distinction during the Second World War, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was quoted as saying regarding the war on drugs, and I quote, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Yet again, the people of this country were divided. Drugs were and remained an enormous law enforcement issue and health issue in America's neighborhoods and streets, and yet so many felt that the effort to curb drug use disproportionately focused on minority communities. And so much more was happening in 1970. Remember, the World Trade Center construction, which would only end in 1973, was in full swing. By December of 1970, the World Trade Center had already topped out, and by the high holy days of 1970, the World Trade Center towers were already the tallest human-made structure in the world, gracing New York City's skyline. In 1970, then law professor at Rutgers University, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had been tenured in 1969 and was still not paid the same salary as her male colleagues, co-founded the first law journal to focus on women's rights, the Women's Rights Law Reporter, and started a collaboration with the ACLU that would lead to her work on hundreds of gender discrimination cases starting the following year. And in August 1970, following years of frustrating failures to bring to the floor of the House from the Judiciary Committee a bill ensuring women's equality, Martha Wright Griffiths, then a member of Congress from Michigan, used the little-known legislative tool called the discharge petition, which required that she get a majority, 218 out of 435 members at least, to support her effort to bring a bill out of committee and onto the floor for general debate and a vote. For nearly 40 days, she later wrote, Griffith stalked, lobbied reluctant representatives, cornering them on the House floor after roll call votes, visiting their offices, calling in favors in order to add names to the petition. Griffiths got the 218 signatures in the required time, and on August 10, 1970, took to the House floor, finally, to open debate on the Equal Rights Amendment. Remember the Equal Rights Amendment? She said, Mr. Speaker, this is not a battle between the sexes, nor a battle between this body and women. This is a battle with the Supreme Court of the United States. With 62 members not voting, the House passed the Equal Rights Amendment by a vote of 352 to 15. And of course, there was the Vietnam War. On April 30th, President Nixon announced the expansion of the war to Cambodia and the deployment of United States troops there. Officially neutral Cambodia was embroiled in a bloody civil war that was helped by the North Vietnamese and the Chinese in support of anti-government forces. Later into the mid-1970s, the war would unfold into one of the most horrific mass murders, genocide of the 20th century. Student protests erupted following Nixon's announcement on April 30th, and at Kent State University, National Guard troops fired live rounds at unarmed protesting students. 19-year-olds Alison Beth Krause and William Knox Schroeder, and 20-year-olds Sandra Lee Scheuer and Jeffrey Glenn Miller were killed at this shooting. 9 other students were injured, including one who remained paralyzed. Massive student walkouts and protests across the country, attempts to restrain them, led to more violence. including the burning of approximately 30 ROTC facilities. While most protests were peaceful, there was widespread violence in America's cities. Ray Price, President Nixon's speechwriter at the time, and Charles Colson, the President's counsel, spoke openly of fears of an insurrection and civil war. Soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division were called to secure the Executive Office building, to engage in the police work of securing government buildings here in the United States of America. How strange it must have been to experience the high holy days of 1970, 5,731. The unrest, the uncertainty, the racial tensions, the environmental degradation, the National Guard and other military units brought in to assist law enforcement, the country divided, at odds with itself. What a strange time it must have been. Especially, perhaps I should add, to those who were fully conscious during that year. Approximately 2 years later, President Nixon would be re-elected in a free and fair election. President Nixon won by a landslide, carrying 49 states and approximately 60% of the vote. Following the deaths of the 4 students at Kent State University, Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver called out his pain and said the following: "Why did they die? I do not know. Humanity's ways are set in folly. I only know that to some these deaths became symbolic. Many die every day. Many die senselessly. These 4 died to history. I wonder," he said, "did we need these deaths to shock us into wakefulness? Once we had a dream. America knew itself to be different, blessed. There was enough for everyone, an open frontier, abundant technology. We spoke feelingly of equal justice and the American promise. For each person a share in the golden future. America the beautiful." And we spoke these words each 4th of July. And then the 4th of May taught the innocents that this dream was a childish fantasy. The words of Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver have been echoing in my mind. Why did they die? Did we need these deaths to shock us into wakefulness? Source of all life, I stand before you on this Yom Kippur and I ask, 50 years later, why did they die? Did we need these deaths to shock us into wakefulness? Forgive us. We, this congregation, the Temple-Tifereth Israel, did not retreat into itself and did not look back. The whole world, the world in its entirety, is a narrow bridge, a very narrow bridge, and we must not be afraid. The community whose men's club what would become our brotherhood, started a jobs opportunity program for inner city high schools in the mid-1960s, helping dozens upon dozens of young people, persisting and changing lives. The Temple Sisterhood that in the late 1960s staffed the first library in what had been the Huff Area Elementary School, now converted. Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver himself, who had organized hundreds of volunteers for programs in the Glenville area schools over a period of years. The temple as a whole that had opened its facility to a Head Start class that would gather within its doors for a number of years. The Temple-Tifereth Israel did not turn back. Nor will we. We will reach out. We will continue to build bridges as a reform, justice-orientated, anti-racist, egalitarian, warm, welcoming, and inclusive, proudly Jewish congregation. We will work harder and touch more lives. We will continue to do so in our worship and in our learning, in our cultural activities and in our civic engagement. We will not retreat. Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver, wherever you are, we will carry on the dream of America. Though the bridge may be narrow, very narrow, we will not fear. We will cherish our rights and obligations as equal citizens of this great republic. We will tend to and celebrate our right to continue to vote, to fully participate in respectful, orderly, free and fair elections, to speak our minds, to practice our religion, to realize our human potentials, and to spread our message of hope. We will continue to speak feelingly of equal justice and the American promise for each person a share in the golden future. We will continue to sing America the Beautiful. May God bless us this Yom Kippur with well-being and peace. May God bless the Temple-Tifereth Israel on this Yom Kippur. May God grant us the strength and the courage to live up to our Jewish values on this Yom Kippur. May God bless our country, the United States of America, on this Yom Kippur. And let us together say, Amen.